In today's video, we are painting skin, but probably not the way you've been told to do it. Most painters chase perfectly smooth blends and end up spending far more time than they expected. So instead of chasing smoothness, we're going to focus on what actually makes skin look convincing: light placement and volumes. And to make it a proper challenge, I'll be using nothing more than an old brush. I will restart this model from a brown base that I sprayed over my previous work. Before moving on to the model, I'll make sure to remove excess paint from the brush. This is done to avoid big splotches of paint, because while I am not aiming for a perfectly clean layer and will be stippling the paint on, I still want to have control of where the paint goes. For this first layer, I'll simply cover each individual muscle, avoiding only the recesses. However, as I move into brighter layers, that will mean covering progressively smaller areas, always moving towards the top in order to create volumes, as if we were imagining the most common light source coming from above. So for example, my first layer will cover the entirety of the muscle that isn't a recess. The second will cover roughly 90% of the area, the third around 60% and the fourth about 30%, and so on, until my final highlight becomes essentially a thin line touching the shadow of the muscle above. This creates an optical illusion that enhances the curvature of each individual muscle or volume. Now, while I gave you some example percentages, I am aware that this won't be possible to follow across the entire model, as some muscles will be wider or shorter than others. But don't worry about that, and don't worry if a layer ends up covering more of the previous one than expected. The only general rule to keep in mind is this: the final highlight should be the thinnest area and directly jump into a shadow, which will then transition some way or another into another highlight. How much coverage your intermediate layers have in between won't make nearly as much difference, as long as you allow a little of each layer to remain visible. Even though this looks extremely rough right now, trust the process. On one hand, don't forget that these models are meant to be viewed from the tabletop distance. Therefore, things will already look better from farther away. On the other hand, we will be doing plenty of blending, but in a very simple yet smart way. For starters, I am taking my midtone, which is whichever color that sits in the middle of your transition from shadow to highlight, and by diluting it roughly 1 part paint to 4 parts water, I am applying a general glaze. This may initially look like a wash. However, once it's applied across the skin, I rinse my brush and spread the paint evenly across the surface, picking up any paint I see pulling, because I am not trying to let it settle into the recesses. Instead, I want it to act as a general filter of transparent paint that pulls everything closer together. Once that dried, I reinforced the highlights again, because not only did the all-over glaze brighten my shadows, it also slightly darkened my highlights, while also softening the transitions between my rough layers. And at this point, it might feel tempting to apply a second glaze to push the layers even closer together. However, we need to maintain balance so we don't lose that very important contrast we worked on. As I mentioned earlier, the most important areas are those highlights and shadows that touch each other and define the top and bottom of each muscle. So having reinforced the highlights once, instead of another glaze, I applied a proper wash to reinforce the shadows. This time, I allowed the paint to settle into the recesses since I do want to deepen those shadows. However, the thin layer that inevitably remains across the surface still acts as a subtle filter similar to the previous glaze, but the wash itself was diluted with its corresponding medium, so it has less staining impact on the raised areas while still maintaining the fluidity needed to remain in the recesses. Before pushing the paint job any further, there is something important to always keep in mind when working on a dominant element of any model, and that is to check how it looks next to everything else. So before continuing, I quickly base coated the rest of the miniature, and as before, looked at the model from a bit farther away. By the way, the model I am using today is from the Crimson Hussar Kickstarter by Daka launching today. While things were already looking better, I still felt comfortable adding another highlight layer, this time using a smaller but not necessarily better in shape brush. It is important to mention that this process is naturally a back and forth, where you learn to decide both where to stop and how far you can push your highlights and shadows. And that judgment only comes with mileage, not perfect brushwork. This same tip-tap stippling motion was also used along the red cloth, and I then finished the paint job by applying a final brown wash over the cloth, to blend the stippling together just like we did with the skin, while also giving it a slightly dirtier look. And I also applied a last diluted flesh wash over the skin to unify everything. Thank you for watching. I hope this video gave you something useful to take into your own painting, and more importantly, that it helps you take some of the pressure of chasing perfectly smooth blends every time you pick up a brush. If you found the video helpful, a like and a subscribe are always greatly appreciated. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.